We've been studying the life of Samson. And this evening, we'll get into the third part of this series, beginning his mission. Last time, we looked at the vow of the Nazarite, and that is so crucial to understand in order to understand Samson and to understand the biblical record of his life, to understand what his source of strength was and wasn't, and what caused his fall, but we're not going to get to that tonight. But there's a number of different stipulations about what a Nazarite could do, a number of requirements that were part of that vow, the external signs of that vow. And not to recap all of them, but two that I want you to think about here this evening. One was that he could not drink wine or anything from the vine. And number two, and most important to Samson's life, that he could not allow his hair to be cut for the duration of his vow, which in his case was lifelong. It's interesting, we won't go over that same ground, but last week we also saw concerning this vow of the Nazarite that his mother is also required to not drink any strong drink or anything from the vine. Yet she's not a Nazarite. So why can't she have any strong drink or anything from the vine? Because anything that she drank would be passed through the placenta to Samson, and since he was to be a Nazarite from the womb, then it would have broken that vow before he was even born. You know, Nick pointed out, we were talking about this, that she would have had to also continue that through the time that she was breastfeeding, because there too, the strong drink, the wine, the alcohol would pass through to the baby. You know, it's interesting that medical science did not understand that through the placenta, whatever the mother took in terms of chemicals would be passed through until 1961. They learned it in kind of a very sad way when they investigated why a certain prenatal drug that was being given to pregnant women had a high incidence of birth defects, and that's when they discovered that actually this was being passed through to the baby. You know, medical science, man didn't know that until 1961, but God knew it way back here in the book of Judges when he told Samson's mother what she couldn't do. I like that. There's a lot of things in the Old Testament when it comes to what they could eat and drink and so on and so forth, that God had another reason besides just don't do it, that people didn't understand, but now we do. We're going to look a little bit more at the Philistines, the enemy, so you can really recognize how dangerous they were, how great a threat they were. And I mentioned also previously that the Philistines were a confederation of city-states, much like Greece. And it's no wonder, because there's a lot of evidence that the Philistines actually were a group from the Aegean Islands. They were some of the sea peoples, is what they called them. Sounds like something out of one of those shows that people watch, but the sea peoples. And the Aegean Islands, and I want to show this to you on the map, what area we're talking about. So this is the Aegean Sea, from which the whole region is named. And that Aegean region encompasses this area, which is now later on called Greece. Here it's Achaia on this map, but you have Sparta there, and Athens there, and Corinth. We know about those guys, right? That's all right here in that area. So that's where the Philistines originally come from. And then they travel all the way down through here, through the upper Mediterranean. They come into this region where they end up settling. And You'll see it more on another map, but they come into this region of what's called Philistia. So it wasn't surprising then that they had that same form of government, or that there were other things that they had in common with people from that area, including those from Greece. DNA analysis proves that these guys were related to the Greeks. Pottery analysis, and that's interesting, you can look at that sometime. Like, pottery is one of those things in archaeology that helps them to identify the people that came from that area. A knowledge of metallurgy and other cultural similarities are all in connection and in common between the Philistines and the Greeks. Their superior knowledge, the Philistines, of metalworking is thought to have given them a big military advantage over the Israelites when they first come into the area. And that knowledge of metalworking is evidenced in the description of Goliath's armor as he's fighting David in that record in Samuel. He wears a bronze helmet. Goliath wears a bronze helmet when more typically it was a feathered headdress that adorned the armor. The description of his spear, his helmet, his coat of mail, and bronze greaves are all features of those Aegean arms, which are also very similar to those of the Greeks. Goliath's spear in the account in Samuel is likened unto a weaver's beam, because that was a weapon that they were unfamiliar with, so they just kind of said, well, it's a lot like, looks like that, a weaver's beam. So all of that stuff is just interesting, kind of understanding these guys from Philistia who were such a superior fighting force in large part because of the weapons that they carried. We're going to look at another map here to see another very obvious thing once you look at a map that tells you how intimidating these Philistines must have been. And this is a map that shows the area that they traveled, that Israel traveled when they came out of Egypt on their way over here to the Promised Land. Now, they're leaving from Egypt, and what I'm pointing at on the map is the area of Goshen, and that's identified as kind of their departure, their point of departure, Goshen. And let's say you were going to go from Goshen, here you are, and where you want to go to is right up here. What would you choose? Path would you choose? Would you choose A or would you choose B?
A.
You'd choose A. You would choose A. You know, I was thinking about this, and it's obvious that the reason why they didn't go this way, and God says it in the record, is because he did not want them to pass the way to the land of the Philistines. He didn't want them to travel this way because he knew that if they encountered the Philistines on that journey, that they would be too intimidated and turn back. And I was thinking it's kind of like if, let's say, we decided that we were going to go next fall to a football game to watch Notre Dame play. And we want to end up leaving here in New York, in upstate New York, and we want to end up in South Bend, Indiana. But in between us and South Bend, Indiana is Cleveland. And Cleveland, you don't want to go through Cleveland. Cleveland is just, it's last time I looked, the top of the list of violent crimes. You know, that place, you got to be really tough to survive Cleveland. And so instead of going through Cleveland, if we want to get to Indiana, we're going to go all the way down to Georgia and then we're going to come back up through Kentucky and Tennessee and end up finally in Indiana. That's a long way to go out of your way to avoid a place, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And yet that's nowhere near the length of time and how far out of their way Israel went to get to the promised land just to avoid the Philistines. It is a distance of, this distance would have been done in less than a month. If they went the way of the Philistines, they could have done it in less than a month. This way, it takes them 2 years.
Wow.
2 years. They come down here. They actually spend a year just camping out here, and then the rest to get back up there. But 2 years before they ever get there, only to decide that they were too afraid to go in, and then they wander around for 38 years right in this wilderness area. You know, it wasn't like this is where they did. They covered that in a very short time compared to the 38 years they wandered in it. But that was because they were too afraid to go in.
Mm-hmm.
The Philistines, those 5 city-states, and there are 5, were Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. Okay? And not all of them are on the map because they can't all be recognized or identified. But on the map here is Ashkelon and Ashdod right there, and Gaza there. Gath, which is where Goliath was from, right? Goliath of Gath. Goliath of Gath. That one's a little harder to identify, so it doesn't always show up on a map. It's when it does show up in the description of it is sort of northwest of Gaza. And in case you're wondering, Gaza is the same location, has the present day Gaza, the Gaza Strip, or Gaza Strip rather, and the site of all the current hostilities, and a place that's often a site of hostilities. So that's the same place, and again, back then it was the Philistines that were the ones doing all the fighting. Turn to Exodus chapter 13. In Exodus 13, we have the description there of God telling them not to go that way. Exodus 13, verse 17. And it came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God led them not through the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest peradventure, perhaps, the people repent when they see war, and they return to Egypt. But God led the people about through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up harnessed out of the land of Egypt. So that's what I showed you already on the map. But that's that long way around just to avoid these guys, because they were just too darn intimidating. Look at Judges chapter 14. Yeah, that distance from Goshen to where they want to go is 200 miles as the crow flies. And if you're not a crow, it'll take about 250 miles to get there. In Judges chapter 14, we see the record now of Samson, a grown man, beginning his mission, beginning to take on or look for a way to take on the enemy. And in Judges 14, verse 1, it says, And Samson went down to Timnath and saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. And he came up and told his father and his mother and said, I have seen a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. Now, therefore, get her for me to wife. Then his father and his mother said unto him, Is there never a woman among the daughters of thy brethren, or among all thy people, that thou goest to take a wife of the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said unto his father, Get her for me, for she pleaseth me well. So Samson tells his parents, hey, I saw a woman, one of the Philistine women, and I want her as a wife. I want you to go and make all the arrangements. You know, you talk to her family, you do whatever dowry, you do whatever is needed to make those arrangements, but I want her. Now, is that, no wonder it's a surprise to his parents. No wonder they couldn't understand it. Because that's a direct contradiction of what it said in the law. They were told that when they came into the land, not to take wives of the Philistine, of any of the people around them, of any of those nations around them, not to mix with them, to drive them out of the land, to not have any mercy on them, to not pity them, but to just chase them out. Because if you don't chase them out, then you will end up picking their daughters for wives for your sons. And obviously, Samson's folks are very mindful of that, and they cannot understand why Samson would do this. But read the next verse. Verse 4. But his father and mother knew not that it was of the Lord. That it was what? Of the Lord, that he sought an occasion against the Philistines, for at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. They didn't understand that what Samson was doing was of the Lord. And boy, you can't blame them, considering in the law God said don't do this. But God at times had people do things that just didn't fit with what the law said. He made the law. It was his prerogative at times to tell people, well, in this case, I would want you to do something different. And that's the case with Samson and this woman. God is having Samson pick out this woman. And in that verse before where Samson told his parents that she pleases me well, you have to understand what that word pleased means. It's not what you might think it meant. In the Bible, that word is never used in any kind of sexual connotation, like sometimes today when somebody would say that she pleased him, it might have that connotation. But that's never the way that word is used. It simply means to esteem right or approve. To put simply, that she was the right choice for what needed to happen in the situation. And that Samson's choice, his purpose in choosing her, God's purpose in telling Samson to choose her, is all about seeking an occasion against the enemy. He's looking to provoke the Philistines to fight him. You know, it's hard for 21st century man to consider, man or woman, to consider any reason for marriage besides love, especially in the West. But that wasn't the case over the course of history, and it wasn't the case oftentimes in the Bible. Oftentimes, people married for reasons other than love, and especially when it came to political purposes. Commonly, throughout history, monarchs would arrange the marriages of their children to strengthen an alliance between the two countries. And that's even done in the Bible. Solomon married one of Pharaoh's daughters to make an alliance with Egypt. Jehoshaphat, one of the later kings, made an alliance with his son, Joram, to the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, Athaliah or whatever. And, you know, this is the daughter of, again, Ahab and Jezebel, one of the worst kings and certainly the worst queen that in all of the Old Testament. And he did it to make an alliance between Judah and Israel. Saul promised to give his daughter to whoever beat Goliath. That was originally supposed to be his daughter Merab, but ended up being Michal. And you remember that record, you know. If you don't, it's an interesting one because, you know, here Saul promises his daughter, and David can't understand why anybody would have to make that kind of promise in the first place. But then when it comes time for him to actually marry her, David's a little concerned because he's thinking, how can I possibly have a decent dowry for the daughter of a king? And Saul uses the occasion. By this point, he's intimidated, he's jealous, he's concerned about David taking over his throne, and he uses this occasion to try to arrange David's demise and tells him, well, instead of a dowry, just bring me 100 foreskins of the Philistines. And those guys were not like happy to just give them up. You know, Saul figured that David would die in the act of trying. David's like, is that all he wants? No problem. Here's 200, literally. So you see that people married for other reasons besides love. God even had the prophet Hosea marry a prostitute and have children with her and give them names that would be expressive of his disfavor with Israel at the time. Names like No Mercy and one was No Mercy and something else. You imagine like you being that kid and having that name. But God did it, and then, you know, he has once this woman becomes adulterous, then she's cast away, and then God has him like accept her back, and all of it's used just to teach Israel what they were in their spiritual adultery. At any rate, the point here is that when it comes to this woman of Timnath, she's picked because she will be a cause for a fight. And Samson doesn't understand the particulars of that. Certainly his parents don't understand anything about it, but you'll see how it plays out. You know, the Philistines had occupied Israel for 40 years by this time. 40 years. And that's taken its toll on them. They are tired of fighting. They are so whipped by these guys that they don't want to do anything to get into a fight with them. You know, I think about how after World War I, both England and France and also the United States were so tired of war that they were willing to let Germany get away with just about anything to avoid war again. And that's kind of where these guys, where Judah, the tribe of Dan in particular, are at this point in time. They just don't want to do anything to fight. But Samson's mission, what God sent him to do, is to begin a fight with these guys. He is to fight them. And yet he's got to do this in a way where he's not going to get their support. You know, and he is unique. Samson is so unique that way. When Gideon went and fought, he had, the odds were high against him, right? 450 to 1, but it wasn't 1,000 to 1. Gideon went in there with an army. But Samson, by this time, they don't want to do anything. And all that he can manage, all Samson can try to manage, is to not end up having to fight his countrymen in the process of taking on the enemy. That's the most he can do, is to do something in a way where that fight he picks is at least justifiable enough that they would not fight against him themselves, his countrymen. And that's important to understand as you get into this record more. On his way to go get this woman, in Judges chapter 14, we see the first time that one of Samson's mighty feats is recorded. In Judges 14, verse 5, then went Samson down, and his father and his mother, to Timnath, and came to the vineyards of Timnath, and behold, a young lion roared against him. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. What happened? That's right. The Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. And he rent him, Samson rent that lion as he would have rent a kid, which, that to me sounds like a hard enough thing to do. And he had nothing in his hand, but he told not his mother or his father what he had done. How did Samson kill a lion with his bare hands? Spirit of the Lord. Most of everybody's seen a lion, at least in a zoo. They're a powerful looking beast. They are a powerful looking beast, and they are a powerful beast. And yet here's Samson with his bare hands killing that lion. But it wasn't because of his own strength. It was because the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. Which is also further evidence that this whole business of him going to get this wife was by God's leading, because had it not been, then Samson never would have been able to do what he just did. If God was not energizing that spirit, he could not have killed that lion. And if Samson was doing all of this out of his own desires, his own lust, as most people think when they read the record, then he would have been a good lunch for that lion, and that would have been the end of that. You'll see when we continue, by the time we get to the end of Samson's life, that he will eventually succumb to his own over desires. And it won't be that God's leading him by the time he gets to meeting a gal by the name of Delilah. But that's not the case at all here. And it's not even the case when you have another record that we'll read next time we get into this, of Samson encountering someone else that you sort of can't believe that that's what happened. Anyway, pick it up, verse 7. And he went down and he talked with the woman. After the lion, he goes down there and he talks to the woman, and she pleased Samson well. Same word, just means she was the right one. She was approved. And after a time, he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. And behold, there was a swarm of bees and honey in the carcass of the lion. And he took thereof in his hands and went on eating. And he came to his father and mother, and he gave them, and they did eat. But he told not them that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion. So after killing that lion, when on his way back, he sees that lion, and there's some bees have made a hive in there, and they've got honey, and Samson takes it and eats it, and he shares it with his folks, but he never tells them about killing the lion. He never tells them about where that honey came from. It sounds like just kind of an incidental thing, but that will also become significant the next time we dig into the record of Samson. And it becomes important, it becomes a means, all of this, for how he can engage the enemy without him being considered unjust in doing so. God bless.